On June 18, 2009, a man named James Davis walked into a federal building in Baldwin, Mississippi and began to talk. He talked for a very long time, and everything he said was a confession, not just for himself, for a fraud so large, so brazen, and so deliberately protected by the people who were supposed to stop it that investigators later described it as a second Madoff. Except this one had a beach. By the time James Davis sat down in that room, approximately 28,000 people in 113 countries had already lost money, real money, retirement money, money that had taken lifetimes to accumulate. The total figure, when it was finally counted, came to $7.2 billion. And the man at the center of it all, the man Davis was about to describe in meticulous detail, was sitting in a mansion on the island of Antigua, surrounded by armed guards. He was still paying, waiting for a world that no longer existed to save him. His name was Allen Stanford. And before the end, he had convinced himself, and a terrifying number of other people, that he was going to be the richest man on Earth. Robert Allen Stanford was born on March 24, 1950, in Mexia, Texas. A small, flat town with more heat than opportunity. His grandfather had run a small insurance company. Stanford grew up watching that, the way a man with a modest enterprise could command a certain kind of respect. He wanted more than respect. He wanted to be mythological. He played basketball in high school, average grades, average prospects. He married young, had children young, and spent most of his 20s feeling like the world had not yet noticed him. He tried real estate in the 1980s, Texas real estate, which means he watched a bubble inflate and then, in 1986, collapse directly on top of him. He filed for bankruptcy in 1984 with liabilities of roughly $13,000. That detail matters, because the man who would later claim to manage billions could not, at 34 years old, manage his own household debt. But Stanford had a quality that the merely dishonest often lack. He had vision, not ethical vision, theatrical vision, the ability to construct a version of himself that other people desperately wanted to believe. After the real estate collapse, he moved to Montserrat, a tiny British overseas territory in the Eastern Caribbean. He used what remained of his grandfather's insurance legacy, roughly $50,000, to register a bank. He called it Guardian International Bank. It failed. He relocated, he tried again. This time he landed on Antigua. In 1986, Antigua was an island nation of approximately 70,000 people with a government that was, to put it gently, entrepreneurially flexible when it came to financial regulation. Stanford saw this not as a problem. He saw it as infrastructure. He incorporated Stanford International Bank on the island that same year. He hired a compliance officer who was also his friend. He put his college roommate, James Davis, in charge of the finances, and he began selling certificates of deposit. Certificates of deposit are supposed to be among the safest financial instruments in existence. You hand a bank your money. The bank promises to return it with interest after a set period. The bank invests that money conservatively. Government bonds, blue chip equities, safe instruments. The model works because the returns are modest, usually 3 to 4%, reliable, boring, safe. Stanford was offering returns of up to 15.71%. In a year when US treasuries were paying around 5%, that gap, that impossible, gleaming, seductive gap, was the lie. Everything else was decoration. He built the decoration with extraordinary care. The Stanford Financial Group headquarters in Houston occupied the entire 14th floor of a Galleria area tower. The carpet was thick, the wood was dark. The receptionist wore a blazer with a crest on it. Former assistant Linda Wingfield later recalled that the office smelled of cedar and leather polish, that it felt like a private club, that you lowered your voice automatically when you walked in. He created Stanford International Bank's own magazine. He had his photograph taken in the manner of a statesman, always standing, always in front of water, always with a look that said he had already calculated what you were thinking and found it mildly insufficient. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he used every inch. Antigua's Prime Minister, Lester Bird, gave Stanford an economic advisory role. The Antiguan government granted him citizenship. By 1999, he was Sir Alan Stanford, knighted by an island nation whose financial regulator, the Financial Services Regulatory Commission, had exactly 3 full-time employees. 3 people, watching over billions. Stanford donated to the regulator's pension fund. He funded government projects. He built a cricket stadium. He sponsored a 2020 cricket tournament in 2008 with a $20 million prize, the largest ever in the sport's history. He flew to Lord's Cricket Ground in a helicopter and landed it on the outfield. The photograph appeared in newspapers on 4 continents. He had become too large to question. Back in Houston, financial advisors employed by Stanford's brokerage arm were being handed glossy brochures showing 20 years of uninterrupted positive returns. Clients were told the money was held in a diversified portfolio of global equities and real estate. The investment strategy, they were told, was proprietary, confidential, too sophisticated to disclose in detail. The actual portfolio was almost entirely fictional. The first serious alarm was pulled in 1997, not by a government, not by a regulator, by a single analyst at a single firm in Houston. A financial advisor named Alex Dalmody, working independently years later in 2009, published a piece for a Venezuelan finance magazine called Veneconomia. He called the article Duck Tales. He had done nothing exotic to reach his conclusions. He had simply read Stanford's published financials and asked a basic question: where is this money actually invested? The returns were too high. The risk disclosures were too vague. The offshore structure was too convenient. His conclusion, delivered in plain language, was that Stanford International Bank was a Ponzi scheme. The article ran in January 2009. It was read initially by almost nobody outside Venezuela, but the SEC had been hearing things for years. Internal memos later obtained through congressional investigations revealed that the SEC's Fort Worth office had first flagged Stanford as a potential fraud in 1997, a full 12 years before the collapse. Investigators wrote reports. Reports were reviewed. Reviews led to recommendations. Recommendations were not acted upon. A compliance examiner named Julie Proyett submitted at least 4 formal referrals to the SEC's Enforcement Division between 1997 and 2004. She later testified before Congress that she had been told repeatedly that Stanford was too complex to investigate, that it was an international matter, that jurisdiction was unclear. Proyett sat before the Senate Banking Committee on April 17, 2009, and described a bureaucratic indifference so complete it bordered on complicity. Her voice did not shake. That somehow made it worse. The FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, also received complaints, also documented concerns, also produced reports that disappeared into institutional silence. 28,000 people were still writing checks. By 2008, Stanford International Bank held approximately $8.5 billion in claimed assets under management. In reality, James Davis would later testify, the vast majority of deposits were not invested at all. They were used to pay earlier investors, the classic Ponzi rotation, and to fund Alan Stanford's personal expenditures, which by that point had grown so extreme they constituted their own kind of spectacle. Stanford had purchased a fleet of private jets. He owned multiple residences across the Caribbean and the United States. He had funded a personal romantic relationship with a woman named Andrea Stolker, paying her over $4.8 million using investor funds. He had given $2.4 million in bribes directly to Leroy King, the chief of Antigua's Financial Services Regulatory Commission, the same regulator nominally overseeing Stanford's bank. King would later be indicted in the United States, though he remained a fugitive for years, fighting extradition from Antigua. The 2008 financial crisis changed the math. As global markets deteriorated, CD redemption requests accelerated. Clients who had been content to let their returns compound began calling, then calling again, then arriving in person at Stanford Financial Group offices in Houston, Miami, and Caracas with lawyers. The money was not there. On February 10, 2009, SEC investigators showed up at Stanford Financial Group's Houston headquarters at 5920 Galleria. They were carrying a court order. By 11 a.m. that day, the SEC had frozen all Stanford-related assets. Employees arrived for work and found federal agents in their lob. One broker, who asked not to be named in subsequent reporting, said he knew immediately. He said the only thing on his desk that day was a Stanford CD brochure, and he put it face down. Alan Stanford was not in the building. He was in Antigua, where he had begun burning documents, not metaphorically, literally burning documents. FBI agents who later searched his Antiguan offices found ash residue and partially destroyed hard drives. Two of his personal attorneys advised him to surrender immediately. He fired them instead. For the next 4 days, Stanford moved between private properties across the Caribbean and the American South. He was accompanied by a woman named Prentice Davis, no relation to his co-conspirator, and a small security detail he continued paying with his last liquid assets. He called his daughter on February 14, 2009, Valentine's Day. She did not take the call. On February 18, 2009, FBI agents located Stanford at a friend's house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a town of colonial-era brick buildings exactly 55 miles south of Washington, D.C. He was served with civil fraud charges on the doorstep. He was wearing jeans and a quarter-zip pullover. He had not shaved in several days. The most important detail is this: he did not look like a man who had accepted what was happening. He looked like a man who still believed something was about to save him. The criminal indictment came in June 2009, 21 counts, including mail fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of an SEC investigation, and conspiracy. James Davis, his college roommate and CFO, had already flipped, had already given investigators the account numbers, the false ledgers, the personal expenditure records. Davis had been cooperating since February. He would later testify that he had known the business model was fraudulent as early as the mid-1990s and had told himself it would eventually become real, that they would invest their way out of the lie. It never did. Stanford's trial began on January 23, 2012, in Houston Federal Court. He arrived wearing a gray suit, his hair longer than it had been, the physical confidence dimmed but not entirely gone. His defense claimed he had been a hands-off executive, that Davis had acted alone in falsifying records, that Stanford himself had believed the returns were real. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 6, 2012, they returned guilty verdicts on 13 of 14 counts. Stanford showed no visible reaction. The judge, David Hittner, later described the fraud as one of the most egregious frauds in American history. On June 14, 2012, Hittner sentenced Alan Stanford to 110 years in federal prison. He is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. He will die there. James Davis received a 5-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation and was released in 2015. Leroy King, the corrupted Antiguan regulator who accepted $2.4 million in bribes, fought extradition for over a decade before finally being extradited to the United States in 2021. He pled guilty in 2023. The 28,000 investors who lost money received, through the court-appointed receiver Ralph Janvey, a partial recovery. As of 2023, approximately $500 million had been returned, roughly 7 cents on the dollar for most victims. For some, the losses were catastrophic. A Venezuelan financial advisor named Hector Munoz, who had placed his entire client base, many of them retirees, into Stanford CDs, lost everything including his professional license, his savings, and eventually his marriage. He gave an interview to Reuters in 2013 in which he said that he thinks about it every morning when he wakes up and every night when he tries to sleep, that he will never stop thinking about it. A 74-year-old retired schoolteacher from Baton Rouge named Miriam Thomas lost $537,000, her entire retirement. She told a Senate hearing that she had trusted the certificates because they looked, as she put it, more official than anything a bank in Louisiana had ever given her. She received $38,000 from the Receivers Fund. The SEC paid a different kind of price. An Internal Inspector General report released on April 16, 2010, concluded that the Commission had repeatedly failed to investigate Stanford despite credible warnings spanning more than a decade. Julie Pruitt, the compliance examiner who had submitted 4 referrals and been ignored, retired from the SEC in 2012. In her final interview before leaving, she said only that she hoped she had done what she could with what she had been given. She did not elaborate. There was nothing left to elaborate. Antigua itself lost somewhere between $2 billion and $3 billion in deposits from its citizens and permanent residents, an amount equivalent to a significant portion of the island nation's entire annual GDP. The Antiguan government, which had knighted Stanford, which had accepted his donations, which had employed him as an economic advisor, quietly removed his name from several public buildings in 2009. The cricket stadium still stands. Here is what stays with you once you've spent enough time in this case. It wasn't the scale of the theft. It wasn't even the corruption of regulators who looked the other way for 12 consecutive years.
It was the ordinariness of the mechanism, a CD. The most boring financial instrument imaginable. Stanford didn't use derivatives or algorithms or synthetic collateral debt obligations. He handed people a piece of paper and promised them it was worth something. And for 20 years, because the paper was glossy and the office smelled like cedar and the man who handed it to you was tall and spoke with absolute certainty, they believed him. 28,000 people believed him. And the machinery that exists specifically to stop men like Alan Stanford looked at the evidence, filed it, and turned off the lights.